Right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Ann Siren. I'm the Interim Comprehensive Planning Manager for the Town of Hilton Head, and I'm joined by staff today who's assisting with this webinar, and a couple of members of our Town Council and a couple of consultants. I'll introduce everyone who's joining. Joining me with staff is Nicole Dixon, Renee Phillips, Teresa Haley, Missy Lewick, and Jamie Lopko, who are helping assist in this process. We also have a couple of consultants with us today, Tyson Smith and Kelly Cusino with White and Smith. And 3 of our town council members are joining us, Mr. Harkins, Mr. Lennox, and Mr. Ames. Thank you for joining today. What I'd like to do is present a presentation on the town short-term rental initiative and then open up the webinar for questions. Let me get started with the presentation. Okay. For today's presentation, I'd like to review the project history, short-term rental trends, review the project purpose statement and timeline, and our plan for public participation, our stakeholder list, some resources that we have on the town's website, the open town hall survey, a summary of feedback that we've received, and next steps and how to stay involved in the initiative. The town is considering a predictable and balanced approach to manage the impacts of short-term rentals. This is being managed by the town's public planning committee, which is a standing committee of town council. And the committee discusses the project during their monthly meetings, which are held on the 4th Thursday of the month, starting at 10 a.m. The committee identified several issues for examination and discussion regarding the short-term rental initiative. The number of short-term rentals on the island, their impacts on neighborhoods, the environment, and the island's infrastructure, an imbalance between commercial uses of short-term rentals and residential uses, particularly in traditional residential neighborhoods, the impacts of short-term rentals on the availability of workforce housing, the lack of occupancy limits for single-family homes that are used as short-term rentals, the lack of requirements for additional parking for single-family homes that are used as short-term rentals, nuisance issues such as noise, parking, and improper trash disposal and littering. And in looking at the data in short-term rental trends, you can see data from 3 short-term rental monitoring companies. There's been a significant increase in the number of short-term rentals on the island in the past couple of years. The data varies from these 3 companies. This isn't verified data, this is preliminary data. We will have verified data that we'll share with the Public Planning Committee shortly. But you can see, even between the 3 companies, there's clearly an increase in the trend of short-term rent, increase in the number of short-term rentals. Based on this information, the Public Planning Committee developed a project purpose statement. As a resort area, Hilton Head Island has numerous short-term rental units. And the lack of an ordinance has led to the imbalance between residential and resort districts and the elimination of some long-term single-family neighborhoods. So the goal is to craft a short-term rental ordinance to develop a fair, predictable, and balanced approach to manage the impacts of short-term rentals on neighborhoods, the economy, housing stock, public facilities, and the quality of life of residents and the experience of our visitors. In summary, short-term rentals are an important part of the island's economy, and though most short-term rentals are well managed, there are issues that need to be discussed and addressed. We need to discuss ways to address nuisance issues such as noise, trash disposal, and parking, and larger issues such as occupancy and the impacts on residential neighborhoods. Staff researched many other community short-term rental ordinances. We're unique, but we're not the only resort community that has issues with short-term rentals. We also contracted with White and Smith, the code writing consulting team based in Charleston, to assist in drafting standards for short-term rentals. And we developed an initial project timeline and a plan for public participation. We'll take a look at those. So the project timeline, you can see where we are now, wrapping up with public and stakeholder outreach and data development and research. The public outreach I'll describe in a minute. The data development and research, we received some initial information, which I showed you in that trend line. Right now, we're working to finalize a contract to get more detailed information about short-term rental trends. We're going to consider program alternatives and development, and then finalize the project. And we'll discuss the project timeline further. In terms of public participation, staff identified and is engaging stakeholders, such as this meeting. We're holding open houses to make sure that we understand everyone's position and concerns regarding short-term rentals. We captured public input with an online survey, which I'll discuss a little bit later. And again, we're providing monthly updates to the Public Planning Committee during their meetings. There are a number of resources on the town's website regarding short-term rentals, including upcoming meetings, a link to the survey, a link to stay up to date with project updates. And we're providing this information through email, social media, and interviews. In terms of stakeholders, we identified a number of stakeholders. Obviously, short-term rental owners are large resort communities that allow short-term rentals. The other large resort communities, such as Hilton Head Plantation and Indigo Run, don't allow them. Neighborhood POAs and HOAs, realtors, the Chamber of Commerce, utility companies, the Gullah community, property management and rental companies, residents both in the South End and then Mid and North Island, the Home Builders Association and the Sheriff's Office. If you take a look at the town's website, you can see there are a number of resources regarding short-term rentals. You can see previous presentations that we've given, a list of upcoming meetings and events, such as this, where you can join. The project timeline, you can submit a question that you have. And I really want to emphasize the online survey. We've had a great success and turnout in the online survey, and we'll discuss that in a minute. And here you can sign up for project updates. The open town hall survey is open until January 31st. We've actually had over 2,100 responses so far. The feedback is open to the public. I would encourage folks to look at some of the feedback to get a real sense of what the concerns are, both from owners and from residents. We've received a lot of feedback and it covers a lot of different areas. And I'd like to give you an idea of some of the themes of the feedback that we've received. Regarding the island's brand, everyone understands that Hilton Head Island is a unique resort community, and there is an understanding of a need to maintain that brand. There are concerns that the guests have a good experience on the island and also maintain residents' quality of life. Both are invested in the brand, folks who live here and folks who visit here. And there's some concern that the number of short-term rentals may decrease that brand over time and obviously have the negative impact on the quality of life of residents. In terms of data, we're capturing pre-COVID short-term rental numbers and the numbers that we have today to better understand the trends in short-term rentals. We've received comments regarding enforcement. Folks who experience especially nuisance issues such as noise from party houses want a quick response and resolution of those issues. Folks are concerned about environmental impacts. We've seen a lot of comments in the open town hall survey and in the emails and letters we've received about folks cutting down trees and building big houses on small lots. We've received questions about gated and private communities. Will the regulations apply to those as well? We've received questions about the town's legal authority and a bill in the state legislation that would prohibit municipalities from prohibiting short-term rentals, and we're keeping an eye on that. We've received questions about the location of short-term rentals and comments. Some folks feel that short-term rentals should be limited to certain areas. Some folks feel that they should be allowed wherever they can be outside of private restrictions. We've received comments about the impacts of short-term rentals on neighborhoods, on expectations of zoning districts, and on land use. So there's a concern that the nature of single-family residential neighborhoods is being changed to more of a commercial land use. We've received concerns about noise violations, both day and night violations. We've received comments that there should be a limit on short-term rentals and that the island's capacity is overwhelmed by short-term rentals. We've also received comments from people who feel that the balance that we have currently is just fine. We've received questions and concerns about occupancy, whether there should be limits on the number of folks who can stay in a single family house. and whether there should be a minimum number of nights of stay. We've received questions and comments about parking. Folks are concerned about parking on lawns and on streets. And many comments about quality of life and impact on residents of short-term rentals. We've received questions and comments about taxes and licensing. I'll note that the town's business license regulation changed so that regardless of the number of short-term rentals that you own, you do need a business license starting in 2022. We've received questions and comments about the time frame. When would these regulations go into effect? If I have a short-term rental, will I be grandfathered? We've heard about traffic. There's an increase in the volume of traffic with the increased number of visitors and safety. And again, we've received concerns about trash not being disposed of properly, and folks littering in neighborhoods. For our next steps, we are going to continue stakeholder meetings and open houses. I want to note that the next public planning committee is on Thursday, January 27th. It starts at 10 a.m. The meeting is virtual and can be viewed on the town's Facebook meeting page. Note that you do not need a Facebook account to view that. The public can view that. And that meeting will be recorded and added to the town's website under the short-term rental initiative if you want to view it later. The meeting agenda and packet materials will be published very soon. They're usually published about a week before the meeting. And a link to the agenda and materials will be sent to the short-term rental initiative email list. So I would encourage you to visit the town's website and sign up for project updates because you'll receive a notification of that email or a notification of that meeting, excuse me. The email will contain a link and you can view that information prior to the meeting.
Would you get Patch's water dish and food?
Okay. I just wanted to note that, excuse me. Again, please sign up for project updates. You can attend an upcoming stakeholder meeting or open house. We've got a list on the town's website. Please take the open town hall survey. You can see a list there of the upcoming public planning committee meetings. And you can submit comments or sign up to speak during those public planning committee meetings or town council meetings if it's being discussed there. And just so you can navigate the town's website, here's how you sign up for project updates. And what I'd like to do is open up the floor to any questions or comments that folks have, and we'll try to start those now. Thank you. Oh, yes. And if you could, on the bottom of your screen, there's an icon that says raise hand. So if you click raise hand, we'll know that you want to ask a comment or question. We'll open up the floor to you.
I have one.
Okay.
Greg, are you ready?
Okay. Yes, Greg.
All right, I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
All right. I was just, you did hit on two of my issues. So I just wonder if there's more feedback or response to, will this apply to the private resorts who have their own governing groups that are making such rules already? And two, comments about grandfathering and some of the particular ones, such as occupancy limits.
Sure. I think that's a discussion we need to have. We've been in contact with Shipyard, Sea Pines, and Palmetto Dunes. We've also been in contact with HOAs and POAs that have private covenants. So what we need to do is make sure moving forward that we understand what their restrictions are and make sure that we understand if we put anything into place, who it affects and what those impacts are. So we'll have more answers, I think, to those questions when we have something to look at and review. But I appreciate the impact or the input. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of Greg's question?
About grandfathering for certain regulations like occupancy limits.
Yeah, and again, we understand that we need to consider grandfathering because that's a concern that we've heard from a lot of short-term rental owners. They've made an investment on the island and they want to make sure that their investment is protected and they don't want a sudden change to the rules. So we want to carefully consider any regulations that we put in place to make sure that they don't have any sudden or huge negative economic impacts on folks.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, if you just want to hit raise hand if you have a question or would like to make a comment.
You have Lee Lucifer.
Okay.
Lee.
Lee Lucier. Lee, are you there?
Unmuted.
Lee, I think you're unmuted.
We can go back to Lee.
Okay, Lee, we'll come back to you. Jocelyn?
Hi, Anne and everyone. Nice to see you all. Question for you. As I sit through this presentation, which I've heard multiple times now, it's a great presentation. You know, there's a lot of the negative effects that short-term rentals may have on a community are presented in the presentation, yet we're not hearing a balanced presentation of the positive effects that the rentals have on our community as well. So as this moves forward, I wonder if there's any way you could start to incorporate how much revenue do rentals bring to the community? You know, the positive effects they have, what we all enjoy here, and we talk about our quality of life, has a lot to do with the fact that we are a resort community and have these rentals. So I've just noticed when I hear the presentation, we keep bringing up the negative. This is going to be a topic that will cause some division, I am sure, in our community, but could we also talk about some of the positive effects that the rentals have on our community as we're doing these presentations?
Sure, thanks, Jocelyn. I understand your point. It's when you're dealing with a problem, it's easy to focus on the negative, but you're completely correct. Short-term rentals have been a part of Hilton Head since it was developed as a modern resort community, and they're a hugely important part of the island's economy. So I take your point. Thank you.
Lee submitted his question in the chat.
Okay, I'll read Lee's question here. What would be the effect of life safety issues once renovations being done? Though present codes, if there is a renovation of a certain amount of work, would that threshold also be in effect for life safety? So I think Lee is asking about a threshold for renovations to existing buildings to meet life safety standards. And hopefully I'm understanding Lee's question correctly. I think in terms of building codes, it's something that we definitely need to have a discussion about. A lot of single family homes were built for single family use, and there may be some concerns about life safety issues if you have more people staying in there than you would normally in a single family house. So I hope that gets to your point, Lee, and thank you for submitting the question. Okay, Greg Conley.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Just had a question. I saw that you were working with the Sheriff's Department. As the increase in short-term rentals, are there any data points as it relates to crime and either an increase? Is it staying the same? Has it gone down? I'm just curious if there's any information that you can share on that.
Sure. I was reading through a couple of comments today that were submitted in the survey. And one person who submitted owns a short-term rental and didn't have any other comments other than to say they were concerned about crime. So I appreciate your point. I'll take a look at the quarterly report that the Sheriff's Department delivered to the Community Services and Public Safety Committee recently and be able to share that with you. I'll get your contact information from your registration and send that to you.
Super, thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Okay, Janet Fontano.
Yes, my name is Janet Fontano. I am a permanent resident of the island, and I am also a short-term rental owner. So I understand the perspective from both sides. My first question is, it appears that the majority of the problem is with single-family houses, the parking issues. And I wondered if you were looking separately at the villa rentals, where they primarily are short-term rentals in non-residential areas, versus the single-family homes that clearly affect the full-time residents.
To understand your question correctly, you're asking, should there be a differentiation in regulations between single-family homes and multifamily buildings or villas?
That's correct. And if I'm understanding the problem correctly, it appears that a lot of the problems with these short-term rentals are single-family homes versus villas.
Sure. I don't think that any particular type of development has a lock on the problems that we've had for short-term rentals, because there are a variety of issues that folks have brought up. I would say in terms of parking, that parking in yards and on streets was an issue that was brought up, that I think you could differentiate between the two. But I think that's a comment that we've received before, and I appreciate your input, because I think that we need to consider whether those regulations should apply differently to short-term rentals, or maybe different areas of the island. And I appreciate your point. Have you had an opportunity to submit the online survey?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of variation. For example, an investor that purchases a short-term rental and comes here maybe once a year and rents the remainder of the time, versus someone like myself who lives on the island.
Sure, yeah.
And is at my rental every week and welcoming guests. And I'm hoping that we just don't put everybody in one bucket, because there's a lot of different motivations for homeowners. And the last comment that I will make that I find concerning is that we're now in the process of licensing everybody so that we have a clear understanding of how many short-term rentals we actually have on the island. Yet I can tell you that I've waited over 3 months to get a business license for one of my properties, even though I dropped the application off in person and consistently pursue when are you going to issue the license. So I'm concerned that our numbers aren't going to be accurate if we can't get all these business licenses issued, so we truly know how many short-term rentals there are on the property on the island.
I apologize for the issues that you've had with your business license. I'll be sure to follow up on that with April Akins, who's our revenue services manager. I know that the change in the business license has caused a lot of questions and processing with that department. So I apologize for that, and we'll try to get that resolved for you. In terms of the differentiation, I think you mentioned between types of owners. We've heard that quite a bit. We understand that there's a huge level of involvement, I think, between owners, or a huge difference in level of involvement between different types of owners. We've heard, folks say, well, someone lives out of state and they own here and they never visit, versus folks who, like yourself, live here year round and maybe have, 1 or 2 rentals and manage them themselves. So we're capturing those comments, and I appreciate your comments. And we'll, again, try to get your business license issue resolved. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Gene Huxley?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for doing this and asking for our input. I guess, and I not only own short-term rentals, but actually president of one of the HOAs on the island in Pomona Dunes. And so, one of the things I think about is that whenever I hear like additional rules or requirements being made is do they become nuisances as opposed to something that actually has an impact? And what I mean by that is you can come up with things that that would make sense to do, but then how do they get enforced? And so if they're not being adhered to, whatever they might be, where does one go to see that they get addressed? And I think of I'm in Pomona Dunes, good sized, organization, has its own security group. They can't handle sometimes, some of the things that I would consider probably nuisance and might be irritating, but they really don't have the capacity to address it or monitor it or do anything like that. So, do we create rules that, okay, now we got these obligations, but nobody can really meet them anyway? And certainly if Palmetto Dunes doesn't have the capacity to address it, the sheriff's department's not going to have the capacity to address it. So I don't know if that's a comment as much as a question, but I just put that out there as, we have our own rules here on our complex, and I know the challenge of us trying to enforce them so that everybody here has a good experience, the owners and the guests.
Gene, I really appreciate your comment. Thank you. That's exactly what we've heard from other folks is, there are some folks who are concerned and saying, well, there's no enforcement of regulations in my neighborhood and I'm having a real problem with nuisances. And other folks live in communities where they have on-site staff who can help with those. I think there's a range of experiences that folks are having, and I think that's an important part of the conversation. Thank you.
Well, it is, if I could just add one more thing, just as an example, we had on our own property, we had issues with people parking here who didn't have the, appropriate credentials, hence they shouldn't be here. And, again, the security didn't have the time to really monitor that for us, even if we would alert them to it. So we ended up in, beginning a towing program, and that solved the problem.
Okay.
But it was a really bad experience for the guests. There are these, because they were generally guests from a different part of the community. And so now they had to go get their car from somewhere off the island an hour away, as opposed to get $100 ticket or something like that, which might have sent the same message.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point too, not just about the parking, but the guest experience. It's not just residents who are affected. If you have a party house or folks who are, behaving that in a way that isn't, pleasant or peaceful or considerate of others, and we've got, especially if you have two short-term rentals next to each other, one could be rowdy and noisy and the other could be trying to enjoy their vacation.
Yeah,
and I think that's an
absolutely.
important part of maintaining the island's brand.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Paula Erdley.
Yes. Hi.
Hi, Paula.
I am a short-term rental owner and also a part-time resident here on the island. And I just had a real quick question regarding the data from the 3 monitoring companies. And that's a significant variance when you look at the bridge between the low number and the high number.
Mm-hmm.
They said that information has not been verified or certified. And I'm just wondering how that's going to be verified and how the parameters are being defined as to what a short-term rental is, and making sure that whomever is analyzing this information, that it's consistent information, because a 4,000 plus variance is significant when there's decisions being made that really impact lives. I'm not saying my residence is in PD, Palmetto Dunes, and my experience, and it sounds perhaps Gene, that maybe Gene is in a villa scenario. In the private residence in the home environment, security here at PD and the enforcement of the PPGs have been tremendous, have done really well. So again, it depends on each individual environment, but my concern is more the data point, and if the parameters are being defined to be, consistent, so that we're actually evaluating correct information.
Yeah, I appreciate your point. Thank you. That gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit more about data collection. So we had initial conversations with several short-term rental monitoring companies, and they gave us those initial numbers. And primarily we wanted to show the trend because regardless of the number, you can see that all of them show an upward trend in the number of short-term rentals. Now, we don't have a definition for short-term rental. That's one of the issues that we need to work out. Most communities define them as 30 days or less, or up to 30 days. And looking at the data, we are working on a contract right now with a company, and we should have that data. They said they would be able to provide it within 1 to 2 days. So we should have the data very shortly to give verified numbers. Now, when I say verified, what I mean is that the companies, as they explained it to us, will collect data, aggregate data from the various online rental companies, local rental listings, a variety of data. So they scrape the web to get the data, and then they use their algorithm to determine the location of the rental and whether it's a verified address and then or listing, excuse me. And then they actually have people go through the listing and use data points that we have, known data points, to verify that those are verified listings at the address that the algorithm determined they would be. And the person actually also makes sure that they don't double count listings. Now, there's some variation. You're never going to get an exact number. One, there's quite a bit of buying and selling. There's also, you need to differentiate, is a short-term rental, for example, folks who own a house and live here 6 months out of the year, and then they rent 6 months of the year, or some other variation on that. So that you're never going to get an exact number, but what we want to get is a verified number, and we'll have that information shortly, and we'll share that with the public and with the Public Planning Committee.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. And John, is it John Geisler?
He's unmuted.
Oh, John, I think you might need to unmute yourself. I think we've got you unmuted on our side.
And they can see me, so I'm a little.
We've got you, John. We can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Thank you for having these sessions, and I'm very pleased to see council members attending this. There's several of them, and so thank you for your dedication to listen to the various geographies of the island. I live in Port Royal Plantation, and I've lived here 23 years, so you know where I'm coming from. I've done a little bit of research, but I have some questions, and just because I don't fully understand everything. We have about 2.5 million visitors a year, that number approximately. And that, I assume, is from the hotels and the villas, and I don't know if timeshares are included in there. And any of the short-term rental, Airbnb and so on, whether they're included or not. My concern is that if they're not being included because there's no way of capturing it, then we might have many more visitors than we publicly recognize. That's one concern. Yeah, another concern that I have is, in reading up on this briefly as best I could, that there is a potential for the impact on affordable housing, which is a critical problem that the town is facing and addressing, and there's no easy solutions. But one of the concerns that I've read is that as a villa owner, apartment renter can say, I can make more money on multiple short-term than I can on a 1-year lease. And so he'll give up his affordable housing. And so to go to short-term. So I can't quantify that. I just have seen that as a concern. And I just think that while we're trying to understand this issue of short-term rentals, we might be impacting another problem that we have on the island of affordable housing, which has no easy solution, and we're losing mobile home parks and so on. So it's just a bad problem getting worse. And it's a real challenge to our community to help develop some solutions to that. My research, I've looked at Kiowa Island and Charleston. I'm sure you've gotten these comments before. I think they are excellent models. My view is this is not a question whether we need an ordinance. Yes, we do need it. So it's a question, how do we develop it and to recognize the needs for those that want to rent their property and those that don't want to, and concerned about the community impact. So I would strongly encourage you to look at those two, which you've probably gotten recommendations before. I've briefly looked at the Kiowa Island. They have zones. They have a limited fixed number of applications. If you don't have an application, and want one, and your zone is full, then you get put on the waiting list. Now, apply that to Hilton Head. There are many zones. Each gated community has their own rules. Here in Port Royal Plantation, there are no short-term rentals, my understanding, which is less than 3 months. So that, my understanding is, would bar this 1 or 2 week Airbnb type rental arrangement. And I would assume that each gated community would have their own similar established rules about short-term rentals. So now what about the non-gated community areas? Well, there's many community associations that so the point I'm getting at is that maybe the island is broken into communities, and each one then can vote. Do they want it? Do they not want it? Do they want to limit it? And so you get a local geography input of managing this question for their particular area. There might be some areas where they like it, and that's why people built their houses. And so if they want to have 100%, a high percentage of utilization of short-term Airbnb, that's their community and that's their choice. And some other community might say, no, we don't want it, or we want to limit it. So I combined 2 points. One, look at Key Island and Charleston as models. And 2, I like the idea of maybe the area, the neighborhood, the community makes their own decision. So I think this is a significant, while there's pluses to it, I think this can be a significant potential problem to the island with limited space, traffic, impact, roads. Airbnb uses it as one of their ads. Oh, come to Hilton Head Island and they use it in their advertising literature. So they're out there marketing our island, and we need rules, guidelines, ordinances on how we handle that. And so I commend you for your work that you're doing here, and much needed and very important. I think those are the points that I wanted to make. So thank you for your time, and I will continue to listen to the rest of the discussion. Thank you all for being there. I recognize you all as being long-term council people, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate your comments. You covered a few areas that we've definitely heard concerns from both the committee and the public about. In terms of housing, both affordable housing and total housing stock, that's definitely something that we're concerned about. I want to actually, Kiowa and the Charleston ordinances, we took a look at those at the start of this process. And I think that Hilton Head is a unique community, and we need to have a solution or solutions that make sense for us. And I think we can look at other communities, both for examples, but also for lessons learned. And I actually like Tyson Smith with White and Smith to give a little more insight, if he can, about Kiowa and Charleston and their regulations. Tyson?
Sure, I can tell you a little bit. We started off, we were working with Kiowa when it first adopted short-term rental regulations, probably at least 17 years ago or so. They have evolved significantly since that effort. Actually, you articulated very well. They divided their regulations up by zone, sort of protecting more traditional single-family areas and versus others, R1, R2, and R3. City of Charleston, we weren't involved in. I happen to live in the short-term rental overlay zone, though, in Charleston, and of course, we've studied that ordinance and that program pretty closely in our work with Hilton Head. It's a very elaborate program. It's high levels of enforcement, but so far it seems to be accomplishing what the city wanted to accomplish. So if you have any specific questions about it, that's zoned as well, not according to zoning district like Kiowa, but according to where you are on the peninsula versus other parts of the city of Charleston.
Great. Thanks, Tyson. Do we have Does Lee have another question? Lee Smith?
Yes. Thank you again for holding these sessions. I think they're incredibly important and incredibly helpful. The one point that I wanted to raise regarding the chart that you brought up, it's clearly the trend line that's of interest. And as housing stock is converted to short-term rentals, many of these rentals are necessarily income supported, meaning when the vacation market slows, those properties are going to have some problems and they could become distressed. And without some careful thinking about the number of short-term rentals that the island can support and what happens during an economic downturn, I mean, this could be a real trouble for property values across the island. If you look at what happened in other towns like Phoenix and Las Vegas with explosions of properties that were basically very affordable at one time, but then became unaffordable. There is a concern that when the economy turns and it runs in cycles, I mean, we could be creating a big distressed property market that we could avoid by thinking maybe one or two steps out about how many short-term rentals might be appropriate for the island in general.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate that point. And that has been a discussion point, both with the committee and with the public. I know other communities have looked at caps on the number of short-term rentals and on the impact of short-term rentals on housing stock. And I think those are both important parts of the conversation. So thank you. Kate McCullion.
Hey, good morning. I'm a resident here, Singleton Beach, so it's actually very heavily a vacation rental community. And I also work for a vacation rental company, so I see both sides of the coin here. So I had a few questions and comments. I know that Folly Field is an area of concern because that's a changing community with some larger homes, but I just want to make sure that local, like full-time residents, they can get upset because of noise. But if a house sleeps 16 people and people are just out on the pool deck talking, 16 people can be slightly noisy. It's not necessarily a party or a rowdy group. They're just generating noise, not doing anything wrong. So a lot of in this presentation, you were talking about rowdy groups, and it could just be a group of 16 people having lunch outside. So I think there should be a distinction for that. And I also wanted to just thank Jocelyn for pointing out at the beginning of the meeting that I felt like the presentation did talk a lot about the negative impacts of short-term rentals and didn't have enough information about the positive sides of things, what it does for small businesses, how much taxes our short-term rental owners pay. And that goes to, our schools and different important things like that. With the Folly Field community, it was approved that a timeshare is being built on Folly Field Road. Is that correct?
Could you be more specific?
One is proposed.
There's a time, I was under the impression that a timeshare is going up where the old tennis courts are on Folly Field.
Yes, that's correct.
So it seems it would be hard for me to wrap my head around if Folly Field becomes an area where you're not allowed to have short-term rentals or restrictions if the town approved for short-term for a timeshare, building to be put right in that development. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. That development is actually nested within existing timeshares. I believe it's zoned RD off the top of my head, but I can't remember. I believe it is. But yeah, the entire area, that's an interesting area of the island. And it is transitional, as you noted, and still residential and has short-term rentals. On the ocean side of Folly Field Road, you've got single-family houses and some multifamily developments, condos, timeshares. On the left side, it's entirely timeshares. And yes, there is a new timeshare building being built there now or under development. I think that's part of the discussion we need to have. And folks have brought up the idea of creating zones. I think we would need to be obviously aware that even within neighborhoods, I think of North Forest Beach, the further away from Coligny Circle and Pope Avenue you get, the more residential that neighborhood is. And obviously, the further away from the ocean you get, the more residential it is. So if zones were something that we would need, if we wanted to look into, we would need to think carefully about the existing uses in those areas.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for your time. I know this is a difficult topic. But I do think that short-term rentals have more of a positive impact on our community than a negative one.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just wanted to mention regarding noise, that actually is a fine point that you put on that, because that was what comment that we heard recently was at an open house that we had in January, or excuse me, earlier this month. One of the attendees said, well, you know, people aren't necessarily meaning to be noisy, but with a number of people, one person's, you know, afternoon lunch with their family is another person's disruption to their lifestyle. So I think that's a discussion we need to have as part of this process. I appreciate the point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Teresa?
Yes,
Teresa Lee?
hi. Yes, hi, this is Teresa Lee, full-time resident on the island. Recently fled the Folly Field community to Port Royal because our quality of life was so impacted by the growth of short-term rentals there. I just want to ask that you not assume every neighborhood on the island is like a Palmetto Dunes that has a police department that can deal with these issues. Smaller communities like Folly Field have limited resources, and so they call upon the county for enforcement. So with VRBOs and Airbnbs, if there is a complaint, there's no one to call but this Beaufort County Sheriff's Department. And I'm not sure that's the best use of our Sheriff's Department, is to call and say, I've got rowdy neighbors next door. And then the next week you're calling and doing the same thing. So I just ask that you remember that there are small communities as well as large communities. And let's not assume that every community can enforce rules themselves. Love the island, but we just couldn't deal with the mega houses anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. I take your point about resources and enforcement resources. We've heard a number of comments about that. And a couple of the comments that we've heard are that, you know, people, as I mentioned earlier, are concerned about crime. And obviously that affects everyone in the community and our visitors. And with only a certain amount of resources, you know, we need to understand how those are being directed. You know, some folks said the police are there to serve and they should be addressing these issues. Other folks have said, you know, this is something that taxes and takes away from the resources that could be better spent in other areas. So I appreciate your point. Thank you. Mr. Lucier?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I appreciate the time today. I had two quick questions. With the announced business license fees that are going to be charged for the short-term rentals, has there been any estimate of how many new licenses that would be for this year and next year, is part one? And part two of that is, where were are those fees being directed towards anything, or they're just going to general funds? That's the first question. The second question is, there's been another thing that's been brought up with the town, and that's paid parking. I do think that you've covered a great bit of this today and brought up several points about parking for the short-term rentals. And with the paid parking being on the table, possibly for the season, I believe it would be prudent to get this study done and the jurisdiction over the short-term rentals and their parking before we made any decisions about paid parking, because I do think they go hand in hand. So has that been looked at also with the parking codes, or what's going to be needed with the short-term rentals as compared to the paid parking would be the second question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah, I actually had someone in one of the stakeholder meetings mention paid parking. I know that there is concern that the establishment of paid parking is going to push folks who have maybe taken advantage of available parking in town spaces to park illegally in other areas. So that's one comment that we've received. And I'd like to get an answer to your question from our Revenue Services Department about the fees for short-term rentals and the numbers that they expect to collect. And we'll get your contact information from the registration and get an answer for you on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
You have a Q&A you could answer.
Oh,
if
you've got a Q&A here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just trying to answer it.
Oh, okay.
The Q&A, that icon down.
Oh, excuse me. We've got a question here from Jake Meredith. Has the town considered subsidizing development projects for long-term rental projects? If aiming for $1,500 a month rental range roughly to accommodate the service industry on which our resort economy relies, developers and financiers will need to be incentivized to start a project that aligns with the town's needs and strategic vision. Thank you, Jake, for your comment. The town has an affordable housing program, or workforce housing program, excuse me. And I would like to get a robust answer to your question from someone who's working on that initiative. But we do understand that, as we've discussed previously, the impact of increasing number of short-term rentals, some of those obviously are conversions from, full-time residents, whether they're workforce housing or a higher product, to short-term rentals does reduce the number of houses available for full and part-time residents. Okay. Okay, we don't have any other questions.
Let's take that back.
Oh,
Got one.
We've got one more.
Actually, two more.
Oh, we've got two more. John, Mr. Geisler?
We need him to unmute.
Mr. Geisler, can you unmute?
This is an important topic and hits the grassroots of neighborhoods, individual residents, et cetera. Somehow, if we, the town, or we through a newspaper, get a status report, where are we? What are we looking at? It would be helpful, I think, to the community and to me and anybody else many people that are following this, a very important topic. The paper is limited coverage, and I was able to find some articles. Hilton Sun had an article. They're few, and so anything you can release to the press or a town publication meeting, I would certainly encourage that, so that we're all aware of the progress you're making. And I heard a comment that business licenses are now being issued for short-term rentals. So I'd like to understand that, if that's the case, or it's proposed, whether it's being done, et cetera. So that's my encouragement, is a publication on visibility on the progress you're making on this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I would note, if you haven't already signed up for project updates on the town website, I would encourage you to do that. We'll push out notifications of upcoming meetings so you can see the agenda items before the meeting and be prepared to make a comment if you'd like during the meeting. And I appreciate, the one thing I wanted to mention is that business licenses were required for all short-term rentals, except for folks who owned one short-term rental. And with the standardization of business licenses in South Carolina, the town in the start of this year, 2022, required all short-term rentals to have a business license. So that was the change. We did have business licenses before for folks who own more than one unit. Now all short-term rentals have to have a business license. And Douglas Winters?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So you had answered a question about timeshares earlier, and I'm just curious how the town is looking at this in terms of gated communities, because it seems to me a lot of the challenges that are being brought up are not within either gated communities or established homeowners associations, and the problems that are being tried to be addressed by this throughout the town, a lot of them can be addressed on the HOA level. And there are specific HOAs within the town that allow short-term rental. How will these regulations impact those communities?
Yeah, I appreciate your point. That's something that I've heard. Actually, I just heard at the Low Country Property Management Association meeting yesterday. Was one of the comments was, well, if you live in a POA or HOA, they should be handling this. You should be going to them to resolve this issue. I think as you heard today, there are some different opinions about that. Folks mentioning that their POA or HOA isn't handling this, or even if you live in a gated community, this might still be an issue. So I think we need to bring that discussion to the table. Where do regulations apply? Do they apply to the large resort communities? Do they apply to POAs and HOAs? I think that's part of the conversation we need to have. So thank you for your point.
Well, a lot of times what happens is, we're having all these discussions about short-term rental, and most of the folks that are voting on this are in gated communities, and it'll never impact them within their communities. And I think that it's an important point, because it's something like 75% of the folks on the island are within homeowners associations. And when we start to look at this, there's a lot of impacts that can go either way. I'm concerned that the tax basis is going to go down, and it's really going to impact our schools if people just flock and leave, because this is a beach community with a lot of short-term rentals. And it's important that folks who made an investment in their property to do something like short-term rental, that they're protected in some fashion.
Sure. I think there's a great understanding that short-term rentals are an important part of the tourism economy, which is a hugely important part of that town's economy. So I think we want to consider carefully the impacts of any kind of regulations that we put in place. And I appreciate your point.
Thank you.
Wade Walters.
Hi. I recently purchased a property in Hilton Head as part of a 1031 exchange from a sale in another part of the country. And as part of a 1031, I have to rent out my property. The property that I purchased is a single family home. It is in Palmetto Dunes, and it was rented out previously. But if for some reason I could not rent that out in the future, I'd be forced to sell that in order to maintain my 1031 status, or like kind under the Internal Revenue Service code. It would effectively force me to sell that property. And I'm sure, in speaking to my real estate agent, when we were looking at properties in Hilton Head, there are many, many other people that are in the same position as myself. So that would be one of the other unintended consequences of having a significant change in the ordinance. We do live there part of the year and rent it out part of the year to maintain our status, the 1031 exchange. So we are vested in the island, and we chose it over many, many other places all throughout the country. So the other aspect is what several people have, the gentleman previously mentioned as well, is I pay significantly more in property taxes, since it's not my primary residence as well, which goes to the schools, goes to the police force, goes to all the infrastructure that supports Hilton Head as well. So I just wish you'd consider that in, all the proposals as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Wade. I appreciate your comments. Matthew Morris.
Yes, thank you first for taking my question and your time here. It's been great. Number one, we just moved here in February. We're really loving it. We moved here from Atlanta, and we really enjoy the community. We, before this, did rentals in short-term places too, as our house was being built, and before that, when we were just coming here to vacation. I do live in a gated community. It's a small one. It's relatively new. When we purchased this, we entered into a contract with our HOA, which allows us to do short-term rentals. We don't, but other people here do. And so my question against or statement here is that if you're looking to, obviously we don't know what you're looking exactly what to do yet, but if you're trying to prohibit people from renting short-term, they've already entered into one contract with one body and one entity. which is their HOA. And if you were looking to prevent that, you'd be trying to alter a contract after the contract's been entered in. So I don't know what the legalities of that, but that to me is a little bit of a red flag. I totally support, business license, occupancy regulations by the correct size, whatever the correct balance is, but prohibiting people from doing it after they've already entered into a contract with an entity would be a little weird to me.
Sure, I appreciate that point, Matthew. I think grandfathering and considering existing uses is an important part of the conversation that we need to have about any kind of regulations that are proposed for short-term rentals. So thank you for raising that point.
And if can I have one extra second?
Yes, sir.
So another thing is just as an observation, two things. One, the industry has changed as selection and options have changed. My wife and I, we first started coming in and using hotels here, but we really liked even before the pandemic, but much more so after the pandemic, of having our own space and our own bubble when we did come and stay. And a short-term rental really provided that much more so than traditional stuff. And the business in general for staying places is completely changing, and as options have approached, this is why you're all here. And then number two is when we've interacted in the community, going to see Elf during the Christmas season. There were people around us that we talked to that were all here visiting, and we chatted with them, and they were staying in short-term rentals. So it's as people have talked about, it is an economic driver of this island. We're not building things here. We're not running factories and stuff. This is the economic engine. So it's a subtle, a little bit here, a little bit there could make larger waves. I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but it is something that drives this community.
That's a point well made, Matthew. The tourism economy and short-term rentals are a very important part of that. The tourism economy is a huge part of our island's economy, and the way that we're able to establish such a high quality of life for residents. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're supposed to wrap up at noon. Jocelyn, do you want to be our last comment?
I have 2 questions, if that's okay.
Please.
The first one is more, again, I go back to the theme of data, and hopefully everybody's slowing down with this process so we don't go too fast. But when it comes to the business license, that's new this year. That gives the town, one of the major complaints that I have heard is the town doesn't have anyone to contact when they receive a complaint from a short-term rental. That people call the town and complain about noise or garbage or parking, but they don't have anyone to call. So the new business license provides you with that information. Does the town have a mechanism in place or a way to start looking at data now? Did that clear up the majority of the problems? Now that going into this season, we have that tool. The business license with the contact name on it of who owns the property and who to call when there's a problem. So it seems to me that that's a brand new mechanism that's been put in place this year. Why don't we use that this season, collect some data and see if that clears up a lot of the issue that you're having with some of these, what I call behavioral issues or nuisance issues. It seems to me we're jumping the gun when we've just put a big tool in place that could really be helpful to this problem before we've even seen if it works. So that's one of my questions. What are we going to do to start looking at now? Are our complaints being dealt with better because this business license is in place and we have a contact name? Did this help the problem at all? The other thing I wanted to mention and ask about is I think we need to be careful when council members and staff talk about the affordable housing problem. Just recently, I talked to a couple of people that owned homes near Mitchellville Beach in the Fish Hall area where some of those new developments have gone up. And they have said there are short-term rentals there. They would never be affordable housing if they weren't short-term rentals. I think we need to really look at what are people saying would be affordable housing if it wasn't a short-term rental. I think we got to be really careful with those comments. Look at the neighborhood someone's talking about and really look and say, what's market rate here? If this was not a short-term rental, would it be affordable housing? I think we have to be really careful throwing these things out there without data. So I guess I'm asking the town, are you going to be collecting data on if the new business license helps with the problems? Are you going to be looking at where properties are located to see if they would be suitable for affordable housing? If they weren't short-term rentals? Just some questions.
Okay, thanks, Jocelyn. In terms of data, certainly the more information that we can have about short-term rentals, the better. We are collecting the information from the business licenses about newly registered short-term rentals. I think we had a pretty good idea of the number that were out there that weren't registered because they were owned by one person, but we'll get those solid numbers as folks apply. Regarding affordable housing, just a note, and I take your point about whether a short-term rental turned into, or a single-family home turned into a short-term rental would take away from workforce housing. I think there's a need for housing of all levels on the island. I think even housing that you wouldn't consider workforce, housing that you wouldn't consider workforce housing, making that available frees up some of the other levels of housing to make them affordable. So housing is kind of a web. You don't just have folks living in one type of housing for their entire lives. You have folks moving in different, what you would consider categories of housing. So I think that's a part of the discussion we need to have. Thank you for your point. Do we have time for one more? Just one more? Okay. Mr. Storin, can we take your question before we log off for today?
Yes, thank you. This is Mr. Storin from Folly Field. There's obviously, I mean, this is a very divisive issue, obviously, but in reality, if you look at the Folly Field neighborhood, parts of it were rezoned RD and parts of it were rezoned residential single family. What's happened, and this is an old neighborhood. So when this neighborhood was established back in the 50s, you know, Airbnb, internet, et cetera, didn't exist. So what has happened is that the short-term rentals have spilled over into the neighborhood, the residential single family neighborhood area. And I think that's the crux of the problem, that we need to look at our older neighborhoods. I know that some of the people spoke about their HOAs that allow short-term rentals, but when this neighborhood was established, short-term rentals weren't even an issue. And now we have these hotel houses, and earlier comment was about 16 people having lunch. What about 16 people out at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. at the hot tub? You know, that's not the same thing as, you know, a 16 people having lunch. Nobody has a problem with 16 people having lunch. And again, I don't know too many families, and I'm Irish, so I don't know too many families with 16 people. So I don't know how that comes into a single family. So I think what we would ask you to do is to look at the older neighborhoods and see what you can do as a town to protect old neighborhoods. Because if you lose these neighborhoods, they're never coming back. And they are part of what makes Hilton Head, Hilton Head. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. I appreciate that. Thank you everyone for joining today. I really appreciate your participation. Thank you for everyone who's filled out a survey or submitted a comment on the website. Please be sure to sign up for project updates. You'll be notified of upcoming meetings, and you'll understand what the process is as we move through it. You'll also receive a survey when you log off about this experience. This is a new way for the town to reach out to folks, and we're really excited. And I really appreciate, especially Renee Phillips, help putting this together, and all the staff who have helped make this possible. Please fill out that survey and let us know how you felt about this and ways that we can improve. And thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a good day.